Thank you for that introduction, Jocelyn. So just want to start off by saying thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. So how I got started in coaching was always wanting to be working with the top athletes and coaching Olympian athletes, taking someone to an Olympic medal, and that's typically the goal for young coaches starting out. But when I got the opportunity to work with some professional athletes and some Olympian athletes, quickly realized that they're already really good, and it's hard to actually see some progress coaching them sometimes. So when I was working with some of the Olympic bobsled team in Lake Placid with the U.S. team, some of those guys are already squatting 250 kilograms. Their technique is perfect, and as a strength coach that wants to help people, you feel like you're not helping them as much. So over time, working with younger kids, you realize that you can see a lot more development with them and feel like you're making more of an impact. So that's what got me into coaching the youth space and working with high school and younger athletes. But I realized that even working with them, they sometimes come with their own set of challenges. So if we just watch this clip, we can see that if this is some of these kids' first experience with sport, this is going to impact them for the rest of their life. So the guy in the red might be loving his life here, and he might continue to play rugby because he realizes he's good at it right now. Let's say he's 10 years old, and everyone else on the field is not having very much fun. So the guys are getting embarrassed, and even his own teammates are just standing in the background just watching because they don't have to do anything. They just give him the ball, and they're maybe not developing any skills. And so right now, he may be a prop, but in 10 years, if he doesn't grow much more, he might not be a prop, and he wouldn't have developed any passing skills because he's never going to pass the ball, and he's definitely never going to kick the ball. So if you think about the long-term development and what that does for it, this is a good example of some of the challenges that youth sports can create. So this brings us to, we know that maturation and biological age of kids play a large role in talent identification and in their athletic development. So looking at talent identification, he's going to be perceived as more talented just because he's bigger and more mature, even if he's the same chronological age as some of these younger kids. So when we look specifically at the growth of youth, this is just kind of showing when they hit their growth spurt. So between ages 10 and 14, this is an example of European males and females. So ages 10 to 12 for females and 12 to 14 for males is typically when they go through the growth spurt of accelerated growth. So they're growing up to 10 centimeters a year. Their bones and muscles and tendons are growing really fast, and this can put a lot of stress on the body. So obviously this is also dependent on genetics and their genetic makeup. So if we look at some other populations, like Asian populations, we can see that compared to Caucasians, they have a slightly earlier growth spurt and slightly less. So even though they're not maybe growing 10 centimeters in a year, they're still growing, they still have that phase of accelerated growth. So this is in a Chinese population. And then if we look at this term, which is called peak height velocity, is just another word for their growth spurt. It's the phase in which their height is growing the fastest. Canadian is the black arrow or the black line, and then we look at Singaporean children. So for the boys, once again, slightly earlier and slightly less pronounced growth spurt, but they're still going through this growth spurt. And then if we look at, so you see the difference there. So as they go through this growth spurt, we can see their physical tests all increase during time. So this was a study done. They followed a group of male soccer players for 5 years, and they did a bunch of physical testing. And what they found was when they're going through this phase of accelerated growth, so this period when they're growing rapidly, all their athletic measures increase the most as well. So these tests on the left are just speed, jump ability, flexibility, balance, and then the timing of those development is all peaking right around when they're growing rapidly. So this is in males. But what we see with females is that they don't quite have the same increase in athletic ability. So this is looking at a vertical jump, and we see that over time, males increase and females do not. So even though they're going through maturation and they're getting bigger and taller, they're not getting any stronger. That's allowing them to jump higher. And then when we look at the landing forces of these females, we see that over time, males are able to reduce their landing force. So let's say I jump off the stage here and land. I'm able to better absorb that force as a male because I'm becoming stronger and more able to withstand that, my bones and my muscles, whereas females are not able to dissipate that. So this is relative to their body weight. So you can see that males go from maybe a little over 2 times body weight to under 2 times body weight from landing from a jump, and females stay the same relative to their body weight, but their body mass is increased. So if a female has increased from 50 to 60 kilograms, their relative landing force is the same, but their absolute is more now. So they're landing with more force, even though they're actually not any stronger to be able to withstand that force. And when we look at, this is just a graph showing that their medial movement of their knees, so their knees tracking in during a jump landing, which is typically related to injury risk. And we see that males is the dotted line. So over time, the amount that their knees come in is lessening. So they're coming from this to a bit more neutral, which is what we want to see. They're able to land from that jump better. And females is rapidly increasing. So this is related to the other slides. As they get older, their knees are actually coming in more when they land, which is putting them more at a risk of injury. And when we look at the different phases of growth and how that affects injury, we can see that this is looking at pre-growth spurt, during their growth spurt, and post-growth spurt. Their traumatic injuries are elevated during this time, so that's a greater risk of injury during their growth spurt. And we can also see that the days that they miss due to injury are increased during this time. So their body is going through changes, and as coaches, if we do not account for that, we are putting them at risk of injury, specifically in females. And then to further complicate the role of maturation and growth, we can see that the timing and tempo of this growth spurt varies greatly between individuals. So you can have 3 people that are 13 years old, and biologically, if they are an early mature, so they've gone through their biological maturation earlier, they might be biologically 15 years old. And then you could have someone that's a late mature, which would be the line on the right. So they're going through their growth spurt later, and they could be biologically 11 years old. So you could have everyone in their under 13 group, and they're all going to be at different stages of maturation. So like we saw in the first video, that can greatly impact their perception of sport as a whole if they're competing with kids that are different ages, or if they're getting compared to kids that are all across the spectrum here. And we can see that here in this, this pretty much sums it up. These are both under 13 rugby players. One kid is, he's over twice the size of the other one. 39 kilos. The other guy's 102 kilos, taller than me, bigger beard than me, and the other guy looks like he's, 9 years old still. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just the reality of it, and these kids have to compete together. And as coaches, if we're not factoring this in our evaluation of the athletes and also how we train them, that could impact their long-term development. So we can also, situation that we can have, and happens a lot actually, is this older guy, he's not any older, the bigger guy, he may think, oh, I'm already the best on the field. I don't need to work hard. I don't need to develop my skills. I'm just going to coast because I'm bigger and better than everyone. So he puts in minimal work effort over the years. And then you could have the little one who's always undersized, always getting picked on or getting left out of the team. So he's going to work really hard and, be determined to overcome his size over the years. And he's going to actually keep developing his skills. So even though we have these problems that when you sit back and look at it, it seems obvious, everyone matures at different rates and everyone's bigger sizes and shapes, we still don't account for that typically as an athlete, a coach, or a parent. So kids will, as they grow up and are finding themselves and their self-identity, it's human nature to compare yourself to other peers and, just always sizing them up, seeing how your friends do in a certain test, how you do, comparing scores, even in math class, also relates to athletics. And then we see that coaches do the same thing. So coaches bias their perception of people based on when they mature. So this study was showing a group of Australian rules football players and the coaches' perceptions of it, and basically they broke the athletes down into 3 groups: early, average, and late matures, and then asked the coaches, without knowing their maturation groups, said, how far do you predict them to go in sport? And they predicted more of the early matures, so those bigger guys, to go play at a higher level of sport. And when they did a follow-up study, and they actually did physical testing and skill testing, they found that there was no difference between the early and late matures. So even though they perform similar on all the tests, the coaches are still biased and still think that bigger kids are going to make it further. And we can see this with the relative age effect, where kids that are born early in the year, early in the selection year, get selected for higher teams, representative teams, and they get more opportunities, they get better coaching, they get more funding. So this leads to a lot of problems. And as a 13-year-old, being told you're not good enough to, make a team or play with your friends would be quite tough and could, influence their long-term view of sport in general. And another thing is those late matures that work really hard because they're smaller, they actually typically make it further in sport than the early matures. So you got the early guys that don't work as hard, were big and good as a 13-year-old, don't quite make it in the long term. Then you have the guys that come on later in life. Sometimes you might not, at the 13 or 15-year-old level, you might not pick them to go far, but they're actually the ones that are playing at a higher level in the long run, which is what you would want. You don't want to peak too young, if you will. And then we also see with parents comparing their kids to other kids. Happens with selection processes. Why is this kid playing over my kid? It's human nature, and we try not to do it, but it's inevitable. So just by being aware that different kids grow at different rates, you can at least temper your expectations or your comparisons and try to make them with a bit more information. So a lot of times at the school I work at, we have a development program where kids have to trial to get in, and we have parents asking, why didn't my kid make it over another kid? Or we have, as a staff, we try to select kids to take into the program, and a lot of times we have to look at their maturation, or we have to think about, well, is this kid performing better because he's more mature, or is he a younger kid performing just as good, which means he has greater potential for development. So just being aware of them is a start. The good thing is we do have some strategies, and we do know some ways that we can try to mitigate these comparisons or these discrepancies between different people. So one method that's being used in the English Premier League and some of the other leagues is called Biobanding. So typically we think of most competitions are based on chronological age. Kids are sorted by their birthday or age groups: under 13, under 14, under 15. let's say under 16 level. So you have a spectrum here. And what the biobanding does is it tries to group them by their maturation level instead. So you can measure where about they are in their growth spurt, if they're before or after or during it, and then you can try to group kids and have them compete based on that. So then you might have a 12-year-old playing with a 14-year-old, but they're both pre-growth spurt, and you could have the same playing together that are post-growth spurt. So that way you're at least trying to level the playing field a bit. So this is done in U.S. Soccer, is adopting it. And it's not completely replacing age group competitions, but it's just a complement. So some notable alumni of this type of system, I think, is Harry Kane. He's a famous soccer player, and he's really good. But he's kind of credited his development to a system like this, saying if he didn't get the opportunity to play in competitions like this, he would have got left behind because he was a late mature. So we can do this, doesn't have to be big scale in competition. We can do this within our own training groups. If you have 15 or 20 athletes, you can try to figure out where they are in their maturation and then group them based on that, so that you have kids that are pre-puberty doing some things together, even if they're all different skill levels or age groups, and then kids that maybe are a bit more mature biologically can handle a bit higher intensity training and grouping them together. So within one group, you can try to differentiate and make it more individualized for each athlete. And then the introduction of several models have also tried to kind of break down training and make it more age appropriate, both for their mental and social development and their physical development. So this was a model created by Jean Coté, which I think he was here a couple years ago. So if you were here, you would have seen that and hopefully remember some of this stuff. So basically, we typically have entry into sport at age 5 or 6, competitive sport at least. And then there's kind of a couple different pathways you can take with some different outcomes depending on the pathway that you take. So the sampling years, this is typically what we encourage kids to sample many different activities and different sports when they're younger. So this is kind of age 6 to 11, so kind of primary school before they get into high school, playing different sports. They're not quite as intense, so there's not as much training, so you might be able to do multiple sports as a kid and they don't overlap physically or as a parent in terms of time commitment. So you could play baseball and basketball, and then when those seasons are over, you might play football and rugby, and you can typically do this, and the emphasis is on a high amount of deliberate play. So this is just what it sounds like. It's the kids playing, it's having fun, it's getting them engaged in the sport, thinking about the long term. So it's kind of like if you're fishing, you have to hook the fish before you reel it in for life. This is hooking them into sport and physical activity. And then if the kid decides that competitive sports are not his thing, which is completely fine as well, they at least have a base and they can join the recreational years, if you will, where they still playing, still having fun, and they have the skills to be able to do that. So they're not overly structured, but this is being able to confidently and competently go in the gym and know what to do for your own workout, going for a run because you enjoy it, and staying healthy and active for life, which is really kind of one of the long-term goals of sport, or what it should be. We want to use sports as a tool to make kids better people and physically healthy in the long run. So the outcomes with that, recreational participation, this is where I am now. I power lift for recreation, and I play netball and play just recreational sports through the local university. Because I enjoy it, it keeps me healthy, and luckily as a kid, I developed skills to be able to do that and have fun. There's some kids or some people that will never play recreational sports because they're shy or they don't feel like they know what to do. People that will never walk in a gym because they don't feel comfortable, doing that on their own. So if we can provide people the skills early on, this can actually impact their whole life, what happens during those younger years. Then one of the other outcomes, which is typically what probably most of us are focused on, is kids that do decide to pursue competitive sports. They would enter kind of the specializing years, whereas kind of that during that growth spurt phase, age 13 to 15, they're entering high school. The balance between deliberate play and deliberate practice is more balanced. So this is where sports start to become more serious. You might have conflicting schedules where you have to decide between two sports and you have to start to narrow your focus. And then you have the investment years. So this is when you've committed to a sport, you're trying to compete at a high level, and the amount of play is low, but notice it doesn't say no deliberate play. It says lower amounts of deliberate play, higher deliberate practice. So now you're trying to build your skills, you're trying to compete, you're trying to crack a national team or the next level. And the focus is on one sport. So the outcomes with that is you can actually reach your elite performance, which you're aiming for, but you do have your enhanced physical health, so you're still healthy and you're doing it in a healthy way, and then you have enhanced enjoyment of the sport. So you like what you do and you're not being forced to do it or anything like that. And then the other pathway we have is the early specialization. This is inherent in some sports where specializing early is a necessity because the peak for that sport is early. So sports like gymnastics or diving or ice skating, where typically the best competitors are younger and they have to put in a lot of hours as a kid. That's just the reality of that sport. You can reach your elite performance through that pathway, but it could come at a toll of reduced enjoyment in sport and or physical health. So a lot of times we see kids getting injured early on, and that's going to affect them for their whole entire life. So this is a big issue in baseball, in America at least. We have kids that in the past, you would play baseball in the summer, and then when the fall comes around, you play football, and then in the spring, you might play basketball. And now kids just play baseball all year, every year, don't do any other activities besides Fortnite and Xbox, and then blow out their arm at age 13 and have to have arm surgery or elbow surgery, and then they're never quite the same. So sports where early specialization is not inherent, like baseball or soccer, and kids start to specialize early and only do those activities, you're not providing a broad variety of movements, therefore that can lead to overuse and traumatic injuries. And then when we look at the actual gains in performance you get during these years, this is kind of aligned to those other stages. So in the sampling stage, that 6 to 11 where you're trying different sports, that's where you're going to gain most of your skills for your whole entire life. So doing these skills that translate to multiple sports are going to increase your performance more than only swinging a baseball bat. Like if you watch some of the baseball players that specialize early, they can throw a ball and hit, but if you ask them to run or skip or shoot a basketball, it's like they've never played a sport before in their life. So you got to think about what you want and what's going to be best for the long term. You're only going to play sport for a certain amount of years, and then even if you're the best, you're going to be done before halfway through your life for the most part. You can have 50 years of, back pain because you've been worked so hard as youth. So the general movements are going to be what builds the main base of your performance, and then once you start to specialize, then you're working on the specific aspects of that. So if you think about throwing, relatively general skill, and then once you decide to specialize in a sport, then that skill becomes more specific. Like a baseball throw is different than a cricket bowl, but they both maybe stem from the same aspect. So if you can build that early on using a variety of different activities using the same skill, that's going to benefit them more. So this is just showing a similar thing. Basically, movements, they have transferable aspects like we just mentioned throwing, but there's also perceptual, conceptual, and conditioning aspects. So if you look at something like soccer and field hockey, they're different sports, but a lot of the concepts are the same in terms of understanding spaces and running lanes or passing lanes. And so you can have certain skills like that transfer to multiple sports that you can work on as a kid without specializing and saying, okay, you're 8, you're going to be a field hockey player, all we're doing is field hockey. They might learn some things in field hockey that help them in soccer, which you see that and you hear about that a lot in sports and elite athletes. They say, oh, I learned this golf skill from a completely different sport just because they learned one aspect of that. And then another popular model was the long-term athlete development model, created in Canada in 2004. So this one was based more around the physical development of youth and trying to tailor the stages for their training based around their biological age as opposed to the stages we saw in the last model. So the main things to take away from this model are the different stages it provided of physical training. So like your fundamental stage where it's fun, maybe can't see it, but fun is capitalized, so it's the fundamentals, it's having fun, but doing the fundamentals. And then the learning to train, training to train, training to compete, and training to win. So you can see a spectrum, basically, of seriousness as sport increases, which is what we should see. We shouldn't have training to win as a 7 or 8-year-old. We have to think about the long-term development of that. And then the other big issue with the model is it created these windows of optimal trainability. And it said that if you do not train these certain skills, like let's say strength, for instance, during certain periods, or speed, so we have speed here at the bottom, speed, and it's based on chronological age. So it said if you did not train this during ages 7 to 8, you're never going to be as fast as you could have been in the long term, which as a coach is quite depressing because we want to think we can always make someone faster and better and bigger and stronger. And this was limiting it to things using chronological age, which we know varies between person in terms of their development. One person at 7 years old is going to be biologically different than another. And then we have another model, the YPD model, which tried to just tidy some of those things up in the past that were not quite based around empirical evidence. So main takeaways from this model are the type of adaptation that you can have to training. So this said that basically before you hit your growth spurt and you're getting all these hormones and different things that can provide certain adaptations, most of the adaptations are going to be neural adaptations. So yeah, you become better, you become faster and stronger because you're becoming more coordinated and you can move your body more efficiently, but your muscles per se aren't getting any bigger. If you've ever tried to make a 7-year-old bigger, it doesn't really happen because they don't have that testosterone yet. So even if you're doing workouts designed to make them bigger and stronger, it's not quite going to happen. But a lot of people aren't aware of it, and they think, you know, as a 10-year-old, I want to get big and strong. Well, just keep doing it, and when you get to the right age, you will get big and strong. And then as you get past maturity and start to get these hormones, then some of the adaptations can be structural. So bigger muscles, stronger bones, bigger cross-sectional area of the muscles. These things will then contribute to being faster and bigger and stronger. The other main takeaway from this model, so basically with all these different physical qualities, the size of the text represents the timing of the emphasis you should put on it. So FMS there at the top is fundamental movement skills, and like the model before, we see that we want to focus on those things early on and progressively taper that down. And then SSS is sport-specific skills. As you specialize, then you would emphasize sport-specific stuff more. But we can see that strength has big text all the way throughout. So that means that from early childhood, we want to focus on strength and focus on building more strength, but that can be due to more coordination of your body early on, whereas later on in the post-pubertal stage, it might be because your bigger muscles and your bigger, stronger bones. And the other main thing here is the structure of training. So like we said, like the previous model, the structure of training should go from being less structured to more structured as you train youth. So this is going to look different in different settings, but basically you wouldn't take a 6-year-old and give them a workout and say, you have 3 sets of 10 on this, and 3 sets of 10 on this, and 3 sets of 10 on this. You might have one focus of the day, speed, and you might just do a bunch of speed things and make it fun and enjoyable for those kids. Whereas as you get older, later on, where we have very high structure, this is when you're peaking, this is when you're trying to get ready to compete at a high level, then you could potentially give someone their workout, very structured, sets and reps, they understand it. So you definitely have to not train children like miniature adults, because they're not, they're completely different organisms, if you will. And the other thing with this model, which was good, was it provided a female perspective as well. So everything's the same except for pushed 2 years earlier, because females mature quicker than males. So it's just saying that once they go through the growth spurt earlier, you focus on things earlier on, and you could get to some of the other things later on. So even though we know sometimes what we need to do, there's often barriers to implementation of these concepts. So one of the big barriers is money, in terms of either equipment. We feel like we don't have the equipment to optimally train youth, which is often sometimes not a good excuse, because we'll see later on that you can train especially young kids with very little equipment. Or this could be money for funding for staff, so you feel like you can't hire a specialist to come in and do that type of training, so you feel limited and you don't feel like you're able to do that yourself. Another barrier we see is time. So often an excuse is time. As a sports coach, we don't want to give up our time with our athletes to do any physical development. We think the more time they have a ball at their feet, or they spend in the pool or on the court, the better they're going to be. Whereas it could be a quick 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning of a workout as a warm-up, which is going to have, for young kids, huge development in their strength and power and neuromuscular abilities. So time, although sometimes can be a factor, it's often creating ways to implement these things that take very little time, but have a huge benefit still. And the other thing is know-how. Sometimes, like we said, we know what we need to do, but we don't quite know how to do it. So looking at those models, we think, how do we actually implement this? And that's what we're going to talk about. So one of the main concepts in terms of trying to get kids engaged and enjoying physical training in the long run is this concept of flow, and the ability, or the play between challenge and skill level. So if the challenge exceeds the skill, if you give a child a task that is too hard or too complicated, they potentially in a state of anxiety. So they are very frustrated. You can see them flustered. Their face is red. They're sweating. They can't do it, and you can just see the wheels turning in their head, but they can't get this skill, and they just shut down sometimes. And then you see other kids. So this would be like, the anxiety would be like all those kids in that first video that didn't have the ball. The kids on the defending team, the challenge was too big. They couldn't tackle that kid, so therefore it's no fun. And then the other side of that is boredom. So if the skill level exceeds the challenge, this would be the bigger kid in the red shirt running the ball. That probably was not as fun for him either. He was bored. He was bigger and better than everyone, so it didn't challenge him. So finding that balance between the two is where we need to try to focus our time and make sure that kids can have fun or be in this flow state based on giving them the right degree of challenge and in meeting their skill level. So there's different ways we can do that. This is one example where it's just got different, basically you can scaffold different skills as kids become more competent. So this is a general example. You can insert any type of skill here, and we can see that this is an example of how to progress a hopping motion. So first you might just hop in place, and then you would add hopping with a forward motion, and then maybe hopping with forward motion over hurdles, and you could just gradually build the skill up as their skill becomes better, you gradually build a task around that to keep them in that flow state. Because if they stay hopping for too long, it might start good, but then it becomes boring. So that's no good. So you got to keep adding things. But this could be, if you're a soccer coach, it could be kicking a ball stationary. And then it could be kicking a ball to a target. And then it could be running and kicking a ball. And then running and kicking a ball at a target. So you very gradually progress a skill over time that can suit the athlete. And you could have different athletes at different skill levels. So you could have one athlete a bit higher and maybe just one stage back here. But that way they're getting more individualized training, and they're able to, the skill meets the level of challenge. So what we do kind of in the weight room and on the court at the school that I work at is we pretty much use a bronze, silver, gold approach with most of the movements that we did, which is based around what we had just talked about. So for a certain movement, like if we look at the bottom, horizontal push, for the less technically skilled people, they might just do a body weight push-up. And if you struggle with that, you don't need to go any harder. You just keep doing a body weight push-up until you get it correctly. And you could, I mean, this is using 3 levels. You could take that back and, do a band-assisted push-up or a push-up from your knees. And then if you are competent in that movement, then you might be on a dumbbell bench press where you're adding a little bit of loading, but it's a very gradual step up. And then you could have athletes that at a high level, they might be doing a full bench press with a higher weight. So everyone can do the same amount of sets and reps, but then you're just building the task to their skill level. And you can do this with anything. This is a weight room example. Like we said, you could do it with a soccer drill or a basketball drill. So one of our models, or it's not really its own model, it's just a figure combining the previous models together to show how they all align to each other and how you can focus on different things within the different stages of those previous models. So I know there's a lot going on here, but we'll get into each stage specifically. So there's several models built just for resistance training, trying to progress things across these stages of development, and for plyometric training, so this is like explosive, bouncy type training, and then weightlifting training, specifically the snatch and the clean and jerk, and how you can progress that with young athletes. And these are using the stages of the previous model. So the long-term athlete development model, we have fundamental weightlifting skills where you're doing very basic things. So if we break that down into the different phases of development with the prepubertal children, so this is ages 6 to 9, or could be primary school kids, when the adaptations are neural adaptations, so just coordination based and focused on getting their bodies to move correctly, we had the fundamental stage and the learning to train. So during these stages, we're not so much focused on the performance as much as learning a skill and doing physical training in a slightly more structured manner. So some examples that we do with some of our athletes, if you're talking about core development or shoulder stability, let's say, this is an activity we do, and you can see that they struggle sometimes. But you're working on multiple things at once. So it's not just we're going to do a plank where we're working on our core. It's we're getting a bit of shoulder stability, core strengthening, coordination, catching, throwing, and these kids are having the times of their lives. Can't hear the sound, but they're loving it. Same thing here. So with older athletes, you might think, focus on doing a plank or doing the heaviest weight you can or something like that. But for young kids, and just breaking them into physical development and what that could mean, it's making it fun for them. So this is an activity we did where the teams are competing and they're racing to pass the ball around the fastest they can. So the focus, once again, is not, their feet are touching the ground. That's maybe not what we're looking for, but it's not so much, hey, get your feet off the ground, as much as they're loving life and they're going to come back the next day. So measuring success for them is different than measuring success of the same drill for maybe your 18-year-old group. Other activities, so getting kids to partner up with other people. is great in terms of, first of all, time and space efficiency. So you're not trying to have kids in long lines standing around watching their mates. They're having to interact with other people, so you're teaching interpersonal skills, and then we're also working on their power, their plyometric, their bouncy ability. So they're having fun doing it. It's very basic training, but they're being exposed to what they can progress later on. So same here. When we program for this type of workout, we do have a focus in mind that might be power or skipping ability, and then it's just a matter of being creative to find ways to make them enjoy that. Because if we just said, skip to the end and back, and everyone was just in lines doing it, the kids would shut down immediately, would not enjoy it, and it would not be fun as a coach trying to, make kids like that, because they wouldn't like it. But if you just give them a ball and say, you have to get to the end and back with the ball, not touching it with your hands, then they figure out their own strategies. So he's got in his feet, it's actually funny, training this age group, the females, they're a bit more mature, way more coordinated. They can figure the problems out. So they figured out the better hopping strategy, and it's pretty cool. It's funny to see, but it's also cool because you can see the difference in maturation. They're all year 8. They're all 11, 12 years old, but the girls are more mature, and they're way easier to figure it out way better. So then when we look at slightly the next kind of stage of development, so these are some of the athletes that are coming in to our program as year 9 and 10, 12 to 15, and some of the older groups. This is their circumpubertal, so this is around that growth spurt. This is when you have to be aware of their injury and their workload and pushing them too hard, but also their confidence and their competence in making sure that they're able to meet the skill level so that they enjoy it, because no one likes doing what they can't enjoy. So no one enjoys what they can't do. So if you're giving kids stuff that's too hard, it's not gonna stick with them long term. So this is when they're training to train. These are the training to train stages of the LTAD model. And this is where you're still not quite focused on performance. You're just putting in the hours, building a ground solid base for them to keep working off of. So we just slightly progress all the training variables. So it can be a bit more structured because they're a bit more mature, they're a bit easier to focus, and you can do more complex things with them. This is when you can start to you might give them some things that are structured, like here, you guys have 3 sets of 10 on these 3 exercises, but then you might play a game with them at the beginning or the end to make sure that they are leaving with that positive idea of physical training in their head. Because as humans, we typically remember the first thing and or the last thing that we hear or experience. So if your session is kind of bookended by fun, work, fun, then as a kid, how was that session? Oh, it was so fun. We played a game, and that's what they leave with, and that's what you want to kind of instill in them. And they did a lot of work in between, too. They just forgot about that part. So this is just a simple balance exercise in a gym. Now we're starting to progress them. They're able to be loaded slightly. The structure is still not quite like it would be for an elite athlete or an older athlete, but they're able to start learning skills that can transfer over time. So if you look at some of these guys, they're learning how to do a clean without quite doing a clean yet. The loading is very low, but they're able to kind of meet that skill level where they need to. This guy's a rock star, so he's consistent and he's progressing faster than some of his friends because he comes to extra trainings and he's able to learn some more complex skills. So you can kind of see he's a bit Gumby right now. He can't quite move his body yet because you can see the wheels turning, but this is at a good skill level, so he's not loaded too much. He's able to learn a skill, and we're not focused on the weight on the bar. So he's a year 9, he's probably 13. We don't need to focus on, hey, you got to clean 80 kilos. It's learn how to do this technique so when you're year 13, you can clean 80 kilos. And then some of our older kids have it down now. So these have been in the program for a year. They're able to do the skill a bit better. They've been practicing it more. And then you can progress them more. So You can progress their training based on their technical competency more so than their biological age. So if you have someone that is mature but very new to the weight room, you're still going to start them at a very basic level of training. They might pick it up faster, but you're not going to load them very heavy just because they're older. So you base it around their technique, same as if you're a young child. So a lot of people think resistance training for youth is no good, blah, blah, blah. Stunts their growth. Doesn't stunt their growth. They actually can handle it, and if the kid can handle a higher level of training or has good technique, then there's no reason why you couldn't slowly progress them just like you would any other athlete. So then when we look at the post-pubertal stage, this is when they're a bit older, getting into peaking for performance. So now you can start to focus on performance. They specialize in a sport. They're able to handle a higher level of training. They have the testosterone needed to get bigger for their sport if they need. So if they're undersized and they play rugby, now you can actually put together a hypertrophy plan for them to actually focus on getting bigger. And you can actually emphasize that. If you're trying to tell a 13-year-old that hasn't hit puberty, hey, you need to put on some size, it's going to be very difficult for them. And then they're not going to meet the goal that you have for them, which is unrealistic, and then they're going to get down on themselves. So having realistic goals that they can actually achieve is going to help them with their confidence. So this is the training to compete, training to win stages. You're actually aiming for that performance now. And we can see here these athletes are more advanced. They've been training for a long period of time. Their movements are more coordinated, and therefore we're able to load them more and focus on performance a bit more than just very basic stuff. And there's simple tasks you can do to meet the skill level that they're at. So this particular athlete was a power lifter. So he was focused on squat, bench, and deadlift, and that's all he typically did. And he wanted to get into weightlifting. But his problem was he kept jumping forward to catch a clean, which you don't want to do. So if you're trying to catch a clean and you're jumping forward, no good. We want to go straight up and down. So we just had him stand at the edge of the platform, and then he could tell if he jumped forward if his foot crossed over the platform. So this is an easy way you can use simple feedback to, without really coaching the athlete, they're kind of coaching themselves. He can tell if he jumps forward, and he can readjust it the next rep. So once again, athletes been training for longer, better technique, we're able to load him to his appropriate skill level. And then the structure of training. So earlier, with the younger kids, looked like mass chaos, which it kind of is sometimes, but that's okay because they're having fun. And these are older girls trained by my partner Leslie, and this training is quite structured, but they're able to handle it. They can take tasks, they can do complex movements, and this is them just learning how to jump and land, but they're able to do it as a big group and stay pretty locked in. So this type of thing you can do with older kids, whereas younger kids, good luck. And same here, so like catching a full snatch we wouldn't do with a kid who just started training, but we might teach him simple movements to get the right shoulder mobility to do a snatch 5 years down the road. So it might be, like we saw those, the planks with the tennis ball. So that's strengthening your shoulders, which eventually may include, catching a snatch overhead. And you can also teach them things with dowel rods or light resistance, which we'll go over a little bit in the practical. So you can see the guy in the white tank top is going with the bar, so he's not very consistent. So his skill, rather than progressing at a normal rate, very slow. So even though he's 16 or 17, he's still working with the bar here. And then you have the other guy in the gray shirt is quite consistent. He's the same age, but he's able to put some weight on the bar. And because he's 6'7" and potentially going to play Division I basketball in the States, we typically, he'll only go from the block. So a lot of times he doesn't pull all the way from the ground. So this is, once again, meeting the skill for the athlete. If you're trying to ask a really tall person to lift a weight with a flat back from the ground, they might not be able to do it, and they're going to potentially not get down on themselves or feel like they're doing something wrong when it's really just they're 6'7" and their body doesn't quite move like that. So just by adding blocks for him, he's able to do the movement correctly. We're still getting the stimulus we want, and this is him coming away with a more positive experience of the session. So this here is just a figure composed, I guess, putting together all these other models that were based around specific fitness components as well. So people have, everyone's trying to put training into different stages so it follows an easy, logical progression. But sometimes it gets bogged down because you have to go over here for this source and over here for this, and how do we progress this? And so they're all over here, and we try to just put them together. But the main thing is that they're all progressed based on technical competency. So it's always coming back to their technique for a given skill. And this, even though it's based around resistance training, it can be for any skill, shooting a free throw. So once again, it's a similar progression model because they're based on the same models from before. So during the sampling years or early childhood, we want to focus on a broad variety of movements, making it fun, making it engaging, and not worrying about the loading too much. So for us, with these young kids once again, our overall goal for this drill might be power development or plyometric ability, and this is a fun way for them to do it without saying, okay, hop to that line and back by yourself on your own. So, and this is also a good way to manage large groups because that's typically what we have when we might have 1 or 2 coaches and 30 athletes, and if you're trying to watch them all at once, it could be difficult. So if you break them into teams, make them compete, they love each other, they love the exercises, they're learning how to compete, and they're learning sportsmanship, and they're also becoming more explosive. So for this drill, the only instructions were when you're on the dots, the circles, you had to have 1 foot, and when you're in the hula hoop, you jump with 2 feet. So then they're also learning coordination, timing of those jumps, because they have to anticipate when they're going to land and what feet they're going to jump off of. This was like tic-tac-toe. So this could be us thinking when we create the session, could be agility or change of direction or speed. And depending on the demands of the sport or the actual stimulus we want to get, we can just move the start line back a bit further if we want more of an aerobic stimulus. So if we have someone like a distance runner or a soccer player that runs a lot of distance, we can just make that run up to the cones a bit longer, and they're getting a bit more intense. But you can see, without us telling them how to change direction, they have to come into that, figure it out, a mental game out, and get into the correct positions to turn back and go the other way, without us explicitly saying, hey, 10-year-old, today we're going to work on change of direction and agility, and we have to get into good shin angles, and they're not going to respond to that. So a similar thing here, and we'll do some of this in the practical. This is a great drill because you can just vary it depending on what you want to do. So once again, by them having just to reach and get low to a cone, they're working on a squatting or lunging pattern without you having to explicitly tell them exactly what their body needs to do. They're having to self-organize and create their body in that own way. And then you can use it. You can still coach them. You can still say, okay, good job. Now when you try to do it on this next one, maybe try not to, have your torso too far over the cone where you're off balance. So there's easy coaching opportunities in this, but you don't have to explicitly tell them what you're looking for. This is mainly just a teamwork one. So they're having to go through a bunch of sticks and set it up for the next one. But that's just to show a picture of the type of training that younger kids can do. Circumpubertal. So this is as they're going through the growth spurt. With the females, jumping and landing is very important because they're at a heightened risk of injury. So just teaching them very basic things. You might not think that this is doing much for them, but you can see that some of them are struggling just with this simple task. So it's no weight at all. It's not a typical training thing you would think of, but if they're struggling in it, then they're still in that flow state. The challenge is still meeting the skill level. And same with this guy. So this is before he was doing it with the weights. We started with a wooden stick. There was no weight. We broke it down into each specific sequence of that movement. Got him confident with that. And then because if we kept doing this all term, he would get bored because he's already mastered it. So then we just add a bar. And then as he gets that, we can start to slowly add weight. And that will be in flux. So it might get boring, and then you increase the skill level, and then it might get hard, and then he masters it. So it's just trying to stay in that that perfect flow state. Same here. He's a star because he's in all the videos because he's very consistent. But this is just ways that we progress them into learning that full movement. Same with some of our older athletes. They've been doing it for longer, so we're able to just intensify the training a bit faster for them. And then post-pubertal, similar things. Like we said earlier, it's not taking deliberate play completely out. It's a lower amount of deliberate play. So this is a core workout. They're still struggling with it, so the skill is still meeting the challenge here. And you might just do this at the beginning of a session and then get into more specific or intense training, whereas for younger kids, this might be the whole session might look like this kind of type of chaos here. Those are bouncy balls, not medicine balls, so they're not going to drop it on their face. Or if they do, it won't hurt as much. And similar here. You still want to make sure they enjoy training. If they don't enjoy training, they're either not going to train hard or they're not going to train at all. So if you're in a setting where they have to train, you might not get the benefit you want from them if they don't enjoy it. So to wrap up, to think about when we want to create a nurturing environment for long-term success, the first part of that, creating a nurturing environment, is creating. You have to be creative working with athletes. They'll figure out strategies and ways to cheat what you've tried to do for them, but you also have to be creative in ways to engage them and keep them coming back for more. So figuring out ways to do that, we talked a little bit about, but it's just about making them fun and thinking about the type of stage that they're at and what the goal of their training is for them. And then if we think about long-term sporting success, just thinking about breaking that down even more long-term, is that for your athlete going to be the next year or 2 years only? So if they're 13, is long-term for you thinking about 15 years, or is it thinking about 50 years down the road, what their outlook on sport is going to be? And I think we would want their long-term aspect of that to be kind of their lifelong perception of sport. And then sporting success, so that can also be relative. For some kids, it might not be being an Olympic champion, even if that's your goal for them. It might be having fun and being able to play with his friends on the weekends. So being explicit about these goals when you define them and kind of with your athletes and what level they're at and where they want to be at would be very important to keep in mind. I think that's all I have. Okay, so now with the Mentimeter questions, this is the first one I have because I've tried to pick out a couple things that I think are important and some of the main keys. So if you guys are all logged into your little Mentimeter thing. So what fitness component, and this is based on that YPD model, is the most important to develop starting? Oh, we already got the answers. Oh, no, I don't want that. Okay, let's see what we got here. Ooh. We'll let the voting keep going for a bit. Oh, there's the answer. It's actually strength. Fundamental movement skills we do want to focus on early, but if you think about the most important to develop, maybe that was my fault. I didn't explain that very good. Maybe strength is the one that has the big text and stays big all the way throughout development. So strength would be probably one of the most important to develop. Well, it probably is, because it's going to influence speed and agility and aerobic conditioning, whereas fundamental movement skills, we want to focus on that early on, but then once we kind of grasp that, then we want to be able to leave that behind and focus on the more specific things. So the wording of the question was bad. You guys are all right, and I stuffed up the question. All right, so for the other question, what's your resistance training exercise progression be based on? Oh, yeah. Okay, I explained that one pretty good then, I think. You guys are getting it. Technical competency, correct. Great job. So even if the chronological age, if they're 18 years old and you think they should be doing a full clean or this ridiculous thing you saw on Instagram because they're 18 and the athlete in the video was 18, if your athlete can't quite do that yet, it's always going to be based on their ability to perform that movement. So always meeting the athlete where they are rather than where you think they should be based on their age or their maturation. Yep, when's the most vulnerable time for injury in youth? So peak height velocity would be more correct, maybe so, but they're young, so typically injury is not as important then because they're not growing as fast, and when they are colliding, sometimes, unless you're like the big kid in the first video, there's typically not as much impact, and they're not as vulnerable to injury. So peak height velocity, it's a certain phase. It could be a year for people, and it's going to depend on each person, but that's typically when their bones are growing fast, so it puts stress on their tendons and their muscles, and you get overuse injuries and also traumatic injuries because they're becoming bigger, but they're not quite stronger yet. So then you have these collisions with less coordinated people, which is more impact on the body. So thank you for your participation and listening very intently.